Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching Augustus fights in Spain, Thrace, Yemen, Africa by kings and generals. Now this is the second part in their series on the reign of Augustus. Last time we saw a lot of the first emperor's political achievements, how he truly built the Roman Empire as we recognize it today. In this episode, we're going to get to see some of his military achievements, the other side of the coin. Now, if you guys end up enjoying this one, I'd appreciate it if you'd leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and check out my Patreon, which is linked down below and will give you access to a whole bunch of exclusive videos. Now, with all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction.
At its foundation in 753 BCE, Rome was just a small city-state. But by 27 BCE, the Roman Empire had become a sprawling expanse of territory stretching across the Mediterranean.
Even before the Roman Empire was officially established, the Roman Republic was an empire in its own right, which can be a little confusing to talk about. So, when Augustus takes over as princeps, or more accurately, as our first emperor of Rome, he's already ruling over a pretty extensive and expansive empire.
From the tip of Gaul in the northwest to the newly annexed breadbasket of Egypt. But this painting was not yet complete. The great conquests of Pompey, Caesar, and Octavian were still interspersed with rebellious tribes and semi-independent client states not yet brought into the imperial fold. Octavian promised security and appointed a cabal of men to deliver it. Welcome to our episode on the military campaigns of the early part of Augustus's reign, in which we will chronicle how Rome's first emperor brought stability to his massive imperial realm. This video is sponsored by our YouTube members and patrons, who get 2 exclusive videos weekly, not available anywhere else, for their kind support of our channel.
Hey, and by the way, shout out to all of my YouTube members and patrons. You can find both of those linked down below, and those will give you access to, at this point, years worth of exclusive videos. So hey, go check that out.
You can join their ranks to watch more than 160 videos, including our series on the Pacific War, Punic Wars, Persian Wars, Spanish War of Succession, Russo-Japanese War, North African Campaign of World War II, History of Prussia, Italian Unification Wars, Risorgimento, Albigensian Crusades, and much more.
So many wars.
Click the link in the description or pinned comment to get the exclusive videos, early access to all public videos, our schedule, wallpapers, access to a special Discord server where we're very active, and much more. Thanks for supporting us. We couldn't be doing it without your help. In the intervening years between the end of the Civil War and the First Settlement, many of Augustus's generals remained active in the field. Indeed, with such a large army and many veterans demanding their pensions, it may have been impossible for the Romans not to seek new conquests to fund Augustus's massive force reduction.
Yeah, this had been an issue through recent Roman history. You had years and years of civil wars, which, they weren't constant. They were sort of off and on. And what the leaders of the time, Mark Antony, Julius Caesar, Augustus, found is that when they were done with actively engaging in civil war, they had an issue, which was what to do with all of their veterans. Right? It was pretty difficult to keep them going because they were demanding to be paid, which was often difficult. And a lot of them often wanted to retire and take over their promised plot of land. Julius Caesar had a big issue offering this. He was sort of stringing his veterans along until he could find the resources to pay them. Augustus had something similar. And so one of your options, especially if the civil wars were over, which at this point they were, was to keep campaigning, keep conquering more territory, because that was probably Rome's most effective way of bringing in new resources and new funds to keep the empire and the armies of the empire going.
However, the largest and most politically inconvenient of these conquests would prove to be a flashpoint on Rome's northern borders, on the middle and lower Danube. The commander of this war was a man named Marcus Licinius Crassus, son of the infamous general who had been defeated at the Battle of Carrhae just over 2 decades before.
And of course, Crassus had done more than that. He was one of the original first triumvirs, which was the alliance between Crassus, Pompey, and Caesar, three of the most influential men in Roman politics at that time, with Pompey being the established general, Caesar being the up-and-comer, and Crassus being the money. That's what he brought to the picture. Of course, he had been pretty horrifically defeated at Carrhae, and, that became a big part of his legacy. So now we've got a Crassus descendant here, so interesting to see the name Crassus back in the mix after all these years.
Crassus commanded Roman forces in what was then the province of Macedonia, south of the various peoples of Mysia who inhabited the Danubian border in 30 BCE. These peoples had been in conflict with a group of migrating peoples from the northeast, the Bastarnae, who were possibly an early Germanic tribe. The Romans initially did not consider this worth their involvement, but when the Bastarnae had finished their conquest of the Triballi, Dardani and Mysia, they crossed into the territory of the Thracian Dentheleti. The king of the Dentheleti, Thace, requested Roman aid, and Crassus happily obliged. Crassus's approach was enough to send the Bastarnae into a panic and force them to retreat. Eager to prove himself, Crassus pursued them across the Danubian plain into Segestica, the stronghold of the subjugated Mysi.
And, not to get off topic again, but eager to prove himself? Well, we can see why he was eager to prove himself, knowing about the previous Crassus.
Crassus pursued them across the Danubian plain into Segestica, the stronghold of the subjugated Mysi. He sent forth his vanguard, which the Mysi mistook for the entirety of Crassus's force, compelling them to lead a sortie out of their stronghold. This proved a grave tactical blunder that allowed Crassus to quickly crush the defenders with reinforcements. The Bastarnae, still in retreat, came up against the Sabritsa River and sent envoys to parley with Crassus. Instead, Crassus extracted what information he could from the diplomats and prepared a night attack on the Bastarnae. Crassus sent his scouts ahead, drawing out the Bastarnae to the edge of a forest, into which they pursued the scouts, only to be ambushed.
Very sneaky.
The Roman historian Florus preserves several details, including how Crassus dueled and slew the Bastarnae king Deldo, and
I find that pretty unlikely, I have to say.
Captured his armor and equipment.
I'm not saying it's impossible. It could have happened, but I find it unlikely. Improbable.
After this, a massacre followed, and the now leaderless Bastarnae scattered. Thus, Crassus turned his attention back to the Mysi, but the campaign season was drawing to a close, and he was forced to turn south to the Thraci for safe harbor. The Thraci misinterpreted this move as hostile and attacked his forces, but without other options, he endured the winter in their lands. The receding winter brought another bout of raids from the Bastarnae against the Dentheleti, who once again called on Crassus. Crassus advanced to the field with forced marches, defeating the weakened Bastarnae again, before turning back south against the Thraci, quickly defeating the Serdi, Bessi and Maedi, but sparing the Odrissi for their loyalty and service to Dionysus, being awarded the lands of the Bessi for their faithfulness to Crassus.
Interesting. We can see here how Rome was able to establish itself even beyond its own borders when you have these border states who usually would have some type of relationship to Rome, maybe a puppet state, maybe some type of alliance. When they get attacked, they call for Roman assistance, Roman help, and that of course further allows the Roman Empire to expand its borders, essentially. When you are the biggest empire in the area, and probably in the world at this point, everyone around you is going to turn to you, either as an enemy or as an ally.
Meanwhile, the king of the Roman-aligned Getae tribe, Rollis, also approached Crassus for aid against a usurper named Dapix. Crassus obliged, advancing north to the Danube, and engaged Dapix's Getae warriors in battle before capturing Dapix's fortress, slaying the usurper king himself, and subjugating his lands. Crassus then advanced on the kingdom of Xeraxes, targeting the fortress of Ganukla. Xeraxes had abandoned the fortress to seek aid from further north, and Crassus assaulted it from land and the Danube, upon whence it was situated, capturing it quickly. In just 2 years, Crassus had massively expanded Roman territory, subjugating all of Mysia. However, his success did not sit well with Augustus. Crassus demanded to dedicate the armor of King Deldo in the temple of Jupiter Feretrius, and his troops proclaimed him imperator. Augustus could not allow either of these to be permitted. Augustus
couldn't. Now remember, this is pretty early in the reign of Augustus. I mean, so early that it almost wasn't even a reign. I mean, this is a time when everything was still a little bit up in the air. Augustus was less powerful than he would be in the following years. He was still very powerful, don't get me wrong, but he still had a lot of authority that he hadn't yet claimed. And so, given that the civil wars had just ended, he was especially suspicious of successful and popular generals, given that successful and popular generals had, for the previous years, all been fighting to control the Republic. And so Augustus, even though Crassus has made some pretty impressive victories here, Augustus can't let that slide.
Allowed Crassus a triumph, but the younger Crassus's political and military career was then cut short, and he disappeared from public life.
Yeah, so he was allowed the honor of a triumph for his success, but then he was essentially, I mean, I'm not sure what exactly happened. Seems like he was sort of sent into retirement after that. Like, all right, you're done. Thank you for your conquests. You will not be conquering anything else because you'll become too much of a risk. I think the name Crassus today, that still reminds us of that great Roman defeat. But hey, that Crassus we saw there, that was some pretty impressive Roman successes.
When Augustus reached his first settlement with the Senate in 27 BCE, he had done so under the promise that his retention of the proconsular imperium was for the pacification of Rome's new conquests. While officially, the doors of the Temple of Janus had been closed to signify the end of all ongoing wars, in actuality, the newly secured peace was quite unstable. The year before, 2 revolts had already occurred in Egypt, followed by a major war with the Meroites of Nubia, along with continued border wars in Spain and on the Danube.
Of course, Egypt was still up in arms. We were coming off that most recent civil war between Augustus or Octavian and Mark Antony. And of course, Mark Antony's base of operations with Cleopatra had been in Egypt. And though, Augustus liked to frame Mark Antony as if he'd gone fully Egyptian, I think that's a bit of an over-exaggeration. It is true that Mark Antony was based in Egypt, and certainly him being there was a big boon for Egypt. Cleopatra was able to essentially maneuver that into granting Egypt a lot more authority in the region, and now Mark Antony has been defeated. Egypt has been officially absorbed into the Roman Empire, no longer an ally or even a puppet state. It's officially part of the empire. They're not going to be super thrilled about that.
The year of Augustus's elevation would prove to be similarly tumultuous, when the 14 tribes of the Aquitani, situated between the Garonne and Loire rivers, revolted against Roman rule. Augustus chose Marcus Valerius Messala Corvinus to subjugate this insurrection. Little is known about this campaign, but since Corvinus celebrated a triumph in September, it can be reasoned that it was successful. In 26 BCE, Augustus shifted his focus to the provinces of Roman Spain. For 190 years, the region of Spain had gradually been subjugated through a series of brutal campaigns against the Celtiberian peoples.
Yeah, you see a similar process happening in Hispania that you see later in Gaul, right? A similar process that would occur in a lot of places. Spain or Hispania had been a Roman province for a long time at this point. It was better established than a lot of Roman provinces that had been newly added into the empire. It was also quite a wealthy Roman province, so an important one to try and keep under Roman control.
But parts of it remained fiercely independent. The Cantabri and Asturias provoked the Romans by attempting to assert dominance over subjugated tribes of the Vaci, Termagis, and Ostrogones, and engaging in widespread banditry. This drew Augustus's ire, who now sought to complete the conquest of Hispania, arriving in Segisama to prepare for his campaign. He amassed an army consisting of the 1st, 2nd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 9th, 10th, and 20th legions, along with 4 cavalry alae and 2 auxiliary cohorts. He replaced Sextus Apuleius with Gaius Antistius Vetus as legatus Augustae pro praetore, and also placed Pompeius Carisius in command as a legatus. Augustus himself would lead the expedition, bringing with him his 2 potential successors, his stepson Tiberius Claudius Nero, and his nephew and favorite Marcus Claudius Marcellus, who were appointed tribunus militum to begin their military careers.
His favorite, Marcellus. Well, that's interesting because I don't remember an Emperor Marcellus, do you? So, I talked about this in the last episode that Augustus, though he was this extraordinarily successful emperor, he had quite a hard time with his own family. Some of that was partially his own fault. He really did have a hard time controlling his family, but also he got pretty unlucky with succession. I mean, of course, as we know, Tiberius will end up being the next emperor. Augustus really had a couple of choices he would have preferred before Tiberius, but through a sort of series of unfortunate events, not referencing the book series, he managed to lose a lot of those potential successors over the years. Now, of course, this is 26 BC. I mean, we have still got decades at this point before Augustus dies, but even at this time, he's thinking of succession, which you think would be good. Okay, he's got succession on the mind, he's ready, but in the end, it still doesn't go the way he wants. I mean, succession is probably the thing Augustus put the most effort into that got the least results. I mean, usually when Augustus put his energy into something, he got results. Succession didn't go that way. Anyway, just making that point since we have two of his potential successors here.
Cassius Dio first begins his account with a moralizing tale about a bandit in the region named Corocotta, a fictional name which translates to a mythical, monstrous version of a hyena. Dio relates, "For instance, there was a robber named Corocotta who flourished in Spain, at whom he was so angry at first that he offered 1,000,000 sesterces to the man that should capture him alive. But later, when the robber came to him of his own accord, he not only did him no harm, but actually made him richer by the amount of the reward." Corocotta's fictional tale represents one of the many real indigenous leaders who resisted Roman rule in North Spain.
Interesting. Corocotta is still celebrated as a symbol of independence and resistance by local Tabrians and Basques in modern Spain. Yeah, so, I mean, and they mentioned there that this was, of course, a fictional tale, and we often see this with Roman, or even just ancient historians broadly, where they relay to us these stories and events that are fictionalized, but are meant to hint at some broader point or broader truth about the conflict. That one in particular was framed as sort of a morality tale, right? I mean, Roman historians, they were not exactly historians as we think of today, right? You think of a modern historian, the main goal of that historian is to, essentially tell the truth of history as accurately as possible. That's not to say that historians don't do other things, they do, but that was not really the main goal of Roman historians. They were often writing to make a point, oftentimes a moral point, a sort of didactic tale. That's what they were going for. And so, oftentimes, the stories they were telling were not entirely accurate, but as evidenced here, that doesn't mean that we can't learn things about the Romans, or even whom they're writing about, from these stories.
But were forced to retreat in the face of this massive army. Augustus's three-pronged plan of battle was immediately put into action. While he had advanced to Segissama, the legates Thace and Carisius moved forward and besieged Attica and Velica, forcing the Cantabri to retreat into the mountains. There, Cassius Dio writes about how they harried the Romans with javelins on their approach to the fortress of Vindius, a natural mountaintop stronghold that they used as a refuge. Unable to assault it directly, the Romans suffered from targeted harassment and guerrilla tactics until it surrendered due to starvation. Struggling to achieve results with traditional Roman infantry, Augustus was forced to send for more specialized troops from Aquitania. These men landed on the north coast and quickly took Arachilium, beginning a longer but more successful encirclement campaign. Augustus's forces to the south, meanwhile, made heavy use of the ballista to quickly topple hilltop fortresses like Monte Bonorio, continuing his campaign over the winter into 25 BCE.
I'm wondering if Agrippa had anything to do with this, or if I just think that anything good came from Agrippa, because he wasn't involved in everything, and they haven't mentioned him, so I assume he was not part of this campaign. But it does seem a pretty advanced operation, where you've got both an element, a campaign on land, also at sea, right? Sort of enveloping your enemies.
Alongside Spain, the next year saw additional uprisings across the empire, with one particular sticking point being the Seleuci in the Alps. The Seleuci had been a thorn in the Roman side for some time. Both Gaius Antistius Vetus and Marcus Valerius Messala had been unable to defeat them in 35 BCE due to the difficult mountain terrain. Incapable of dealing with the matter personally, Augustus appointed Aulus Terentius Varro, adoptive brother of the future conspirator Murena, to lead the expedition against them. Varro's strategy was simple but effective. He attacked the Seleuci simultaneously from all of the passes they controlled, dividing their response. Unable to unite, they were incapable of meeting the Romans in sufficient numbers on any front to defeat them. And
it's interesting. I mean, we saw in Hispania, you're also seeing here in Cisalpine Gaul, that though Rome controls this territory, and some of it, they've controlled it for a long time, that did not mean that Rome effectively governed everything you see on the map. This is where maps can, I'm not going to say misinform, but can sort of simplify things sometimes. You see this big red map, all territory controlled by the Romans. You think, oh, okay, so the Roman Empire ruled all of that territory. It's like, well, yes, but also not entirely. Especially areas that were geographically harder to traverse. So mountainous areas, right? You see that in Spain, you see that here with the Alps. Those could be a lot harder to control, and you'd often have holdouts or rebels remain in these areas long after the rest of a region had been pacified, right? So even if the Romans officially controlled an area, that didn't actually mean it was actually always under their control. And obviously, as we know, the Roman Empire dealt with countless rebellions over the existence of the empire.
were subdued.
Both from their, could say, their sort of foreign subjects, and from Roman citizens themselves. So there were plenty of rebellions to go around through the history of Rome.
Varro then tricked the Seleuci, imposing a heavy tribute and sending soldiers to collect the payments, pretending it would be the only punishment, only to enslave all of the military-age men upon their arrival. Over 36,000 Seleuci were captured and taken to Ivrea, then sold into slavery. Varro,
I mean, brutal, but typical for the time.
Then founded the city of Ulster as Augusta Praetoria Salusorum, where 3,000 retired veterans and praetorians were expected to keep the peace. Meanwhile, in Spain, the war against the Cantabri proved to be the last military expedition that Augustus would lead in person. Early the next year, as the conflict renewed, he fell gravely ill, with modern historians believing he contracted typhus. Augustus was evacuated to Tarraco on the coast, leaving the conflict in the hands of Gaius Antistius Vetus and Titus Carisius.
Interesting. Yeah, Augustus, I mean, it seems to me, both from his time as emperor and in his rise to power, he was not really a fan of leading military expeditions. It's why, during his rise to power, Agrippa did most of that. Augustus was also frequently quite ill during his lifetime. I think there might be a few of those times where he was conveniently ill, but he was also apparently genuinely pretty sick throughout a lot of his life. Now, I mean, he lives quite a long life, right? So it didn't actually kill him, right? But he was frequently weak and sick, and so that obviously did not make him well suited to the campaign trail, as we can see here.
Who moved to besiege.
And that also might be one of the reasons why even this early, and of course Augustus didn't know how long he was going to live. I mean, frankly, if you'd been a betting man at this point, with how unstable everything had been, you probably would have bet Augustus would have been out of power 5 or 10 years from then. He didn't know he'd reign for decades to follow, but I think probably one of the reasons he was so invested and interested in succession is because he was so sick throughout his life, and there were a couple times when he, like, you know, the moment we talked about previously that they reference here, there were a couple of times he genuinely thought he was going to die, so succession was pretty important to him.
The Asturias fortress of Lankia. The Roman author Florus recounts these events. During the winter, Carisius' forces had built 3 fortified marching camps along the Elsa River, waiting for the next campaigning season. The Asturias sought to take advantage of the situation and divided into 3 large contingents, significantly outnumbering the encamped Romans. In their usual fashion, the Romans preferred to fight on the open field, rather than from the strength of their fortified positions.
Of course.
But they faced annihilation. They were only saved by the arrival of Crassus with reinforcements, who had been forewarned by the Brigacini tribe who betrayed the Astures.
Damn.
The Romans then met the Astures in an open battle, defeating them but suffering significant losses. After this victory, the Romans pursued the Astures to the fortress citadel of Lankia, seizing it after a difficult siege. This likely impacted the strategy of the final battle of the revolt, where the Romans decided to surround the town of Mons Medulius above the Minho River with a nearly 18-mile circumvallation. With the city succumbing to starvation, Crassus entered the gates and erected a trophaeum, marking the end of the conflict. Just as with Varro, Crassus also discharged his 16-year veterans to found a new colony named Augusta Emerita, the site of modern Merida in Spain.
So, I mean, we can see here that these generals, perhaps learning from the recent lesson of Crassus, they're making sure to pay lots of homage to Augustus. They may be the ones handling these campaigns. I mean, Augustus was involved in this one, but he'd left at this point. But they want to make it clear we give all glory and all honor to Augustus, right? So they're making sure that he doesn't suspect them of trying to usurp him. And they're very clear that they're giving the glory to him.
As a result of this great victory, the Senate vowed to bestow a triumph upon Augustus, and for the second time in Augustus's reign, the doors of the Temple of Janus were shut. 24 BCE would prove to be an eventful year, well known for a rather ambitious and disastrous Roman expedition on the far side of the empire. In Egypt, Cornelius Gallus had recently been replaced by Gaius Aelius Gallus, who proved more restrained than his predecessor. Under Augustus's order, Gallus was to invade and conquer the lucrative region of Arabia Felix in modern Yemen, seizing control of the spice trade and establishing a foothold for the future conquest of the Kingdom of Axum.
Okay, pretty ambitious.
A force of 10,000 men was assembled, of which 8,500 consisted of Romans, 1,000 Nabateans under Sylleus, 500 Jewish troops from Herod, and 80 triremes, biremes, and smaller craft built at Asinui. Sylleus was to serve as their guide, but he proved duplicitous, taking the Romans on a roundabout course that exposed them to disease and desert heat, delaying the expedition by many months. Before even reaching the small harbour of Leucecome, just across the Red Sea from Egypt, several ships had run aground on reefs, and Gallus's troops had succumbed to diseases of the mouth, head, and legs from consuming local water and forage. After several weeks of recovery, the Romans set out on an 80-day march to Nigrana, modern Najran, at the north edge of Arabia Felix. The Romans seized the town and its provisions. The local king, named Sabos, had fled, but he soon returned with an army. In the ensuing battle, the Romans allegedly defeated a force of 10,000 Arabians while losing only 2 men, a lopsided victory which Strabo attributes to the fact that Roman equipment proved far superior to that of the Arabians.
I mean, allegedly is the key word in there. I doubt it was that one-sided. That's gotta be an over-exaggeration. I mean, what could it have been, a one-sided battle? Yes, that is unbelievably one-sided.
The Romans then advanced on Marciaba, capital of the Romanitae, and identified with modern Marib. However, the Romans were forced to end the siege after 6 days. Realizing Sylleus's betrayal, the Romans returned to the port of Myos Hormos after only 60 days' march. Ultimately, the expedition was considered a success despite the failure to conquer Arabia and heavy losses.
Yeah, seems like, I mean, you could call it a mixed bag or even a failure, I think would be fair. Though that failure, if it was such a failure, was not really attributed to military failings, or at least not military failings in battle, but to, I guess, betrayal and not being ready for the journey and the environment. I mean, when we look at the Roman Empire and the Roman legions of this era, you know, it's not like they were unbeatable. They could be defeated, as we'll see later in this series, a pretty bad defeat. But they were quite powerful and really could outperform a lot of the enemies they faced in the field, right? I mean, we see they go up against enemy after enemy in different corners of the empire and usually will win these battles, right? So this is a very skilled, well-trained disciplined, well-supplied fighting force, the Roman legions, especially at this time. There's a reason they had such a reputation, but once again, they were not unbeatable, and we see here that even without military defeat, campaigns could still go wrong for other reasons.
The consequences did not echo this sentiment, however. Sylleus was sent to Rome and tried for treason before being beheaded, while Gaius Aelius
Damn.
Gallus's political career ended as Gaius Petronius replaced him. Gaius Petronius would quickly face his own challenge as Praetorian Prefect of Egypt. While the Romans had been away in Arabia, a massive army of 30,000 Nubians under King Ptericetus invaded and ravaged southern Egypt, sacking Syene and tearing down a bronze statue of Augustus. In 22 BCE, with his army recovered, Petronius was finally able to respond to this invasion. Petronius led a force of 10,000 infantry and 800 cavalry drawn from 3 legions and several cohorts of auxiliaries down into southern Egypt, but attempted a different strategy from that of Gallus before him. Instead, he reached out to a certain Amanirenas Candace, queen of the Meroites, and widow of the now deceased Ptericetus.
And, this territory here, it's not like it was so totally unfamiliar to the Romans, but it's worth noting that, Egypt had only recently been absorbed into the Roman Empire. Now, before that point, it had been a Roman client state, which is why I say Rome wasn't entirely unfamiliar with the region. They'd had a presence in the region. Of course, they had the alliance of Egypt, which helped, but they're definitely going out a little further than they had previously. I mean, here we're seeing the extent of the empire expanding.
Demanding to know the reason for their invasion. She replied that the nomarchs, the local rulers in South Egypt, had somehow wronged them, to which the Romans explained that the nomarchs no longer ruled Egypt, but they now did. The Nubians asked for 3 days to deliberate, but Petronius grew impatient and instead forced them into open battle, defeating them with ease and forcing them to quickly retreat to Selchis, while the Romans moved to capture Premnis, modern Casa Ibrim. Candace offered a truce, promising to return the prisoners and looted goods, but Petronius instead laid siege to the capital of Napta, razing the city and enslaving its population. However, instead of embarking on a full conquest of Nubia, Petronius wisely withdrew to Casa Ibrim, fortifying the site and imposing a tribute on the surviving ruler of the Nubians. Eager to avoid...
Well, I guess that's a good way to show who's in charge, right? They offer a treaty, a deal. You say, we're just going to show you that we're in charge here. We're militarily dominant. So we're not coming to necessarily campaign through your whole territory, but just remember next time you think about stepping out of line that Rome is here. And of course, that's the message they really wanted to send throughout the entirety of the empire in these new territories.
His predecessor's fate, 1,000 of these slaves were gifted to Augustus. Across the rest of the empire...
I mean, slavery was a lucrative business. Like I said, enslaving these people in these conquered cities was not uncommon at the time. And of course, that sometimes they would be... they'd be sold off, right? So that'd be a big source of income. And also, slave labor was really the foundation of a lot of the economy of the Roman Empire. So we see that playing out here.
The years 24 to 21 BCE had remained rather quiet, but for a few minor hiccups. In 21 BCE, a similar campaign in Africa was undertaken by Lucius Cornelius Balbus, a Spaniard and proconsul of Libya, who undertook a punitive campaign against the Garamantes who raided north into his province. This campaign would take 2 years, with one detachment of soldiers reaching as deep into Africa as the Niger River.
That is very deep.
It was extremely successful, capturing the capital of Garama and 15 other towns.
I do wonder how deep the Romans... This is the kind of question that I couldn't tell you the answer to. And I imagine there's a fair degree of ambiguity, but I wonder how deep the Romans made it into Africa. Right? When I think about the Roman presence in Africa, I'm mainly thinking about North Africa primarily, which is where the strongest Roman presence was. That's if we're talking about North Africa, that position down there is relatively deep, but I wonder how deep they made it throughout the African continent. I know the Romans didn't have a significant presence super deep into mainland Africa, but I don't know, curious.
The Senate was so impressed that upon his return in 19 BCE, he was awarded a triumph, the first provincial to be given one. On the other
Wow.
side of the empire, the Astures and Cantabri attempted to rebel twice, but both of these revolts were suppressed. Meanwhile, Augustus himself had to order a revolt in Cilicia put down after they had slain Roman officials in the region. However, most of Rome's expansion during this period had been peaceful.
Okay.
The Numidians agreed to cede territory in exchange for control of Mauritania, while the king of Galatia and Lycaonia.
Yeah, and they're saying Numidia was a client kingdom, ruled the region of Africa Nova. Ruler Juba II was given the kingdom of Mauritania in exchange for the annexation of Africa Nova on the death of Bacchus II in 25 BCE. He in turn founded the city of Caesarea in Augustus's honor, so he knows how to, flatter Augustus as well. But if we remember, Numidia had played a pretty significant role in the Civil War. And of course, the Numidian cavalry were some of the best known in the world at this time. They were extremely skilled cavalrymen. And so they were well wanted in a lot of different places. You wanted those Numidian cavalry on your side. And once again, they played a role, particularly in the civil war between Caesar and the Pompeians.
Passed his realm into Roman hands upon his death. The Romans were also able to elicit peace with Pheretes of Parthia after a brief intervention in an Armenian succession dispute in 20 BCE, which settled many matters regarding their eastern border and returned the insignia lost at Carrhae 3 decades before.
Oh, wow.
Symbolic triumph for Augustus.
Yeah, I mean, that's a big symbolic victory. And obviously, Rome and Parthia, Rome, of course, stretches throughout the entire Mediterranean. But if we want to talk about the border region here, Rome and Parthia were the two neighbors, the two great empires of the region. They were always at each other's throats. Not always, I shouldn't say always, but continually, repeatedly, were fighting each other. And as you can imagine, Armenia, being a sort of buffer state in between the two, they would often meddle in Armenian affairs. They could, look, they would directly fight each other as well. But Armenia, they'd sort of shift over time from one direction to the other, and that could be emblematic of who had more influence in the region, the Persians or the Romans in that moment.
Despite this brief intercession of relative peace, trouble was brewing outside the Roman sphere. Since the
Trouble was always brewing, inside and outside of the Roman sphere.
Conquest of Gaul by Caesar, the Rhine had served as a natural but not
This is interesting, but we sometimes talk about this great peace that we see, but even under peace, there was often pretty frequent fighting, warfare at a higher or lower level. I would say whenever you see any type of great peace throughout history, you should be somewhat skeptical because usually there is something going on. Now, usually when you see that, it more means that, look, Rome had gone through this era of massive civil war, and the period following under Augustus was relatively peaceful. That is true, relatively, but of course there was still fighting going on. It's like when we look post-World War II, we call that period, the long peace or something like that? The idea that after the war, the world sort of settled into peacetime. And of course, it was relatively peaceful after the war compared to the Second World War. But that's because the Second World War was so monumentally devastating. Of course, wars, civil war, rebellion continued to happen pretty consistently in the years following the Second World War.
Since the conquest of Gaul by Caesar, the Rhine had served as a natural but not impenetrable barrier, with the Germanic peoples expanding across northern Europe.
Yeah.
For decades, they had conducted minor raids into newly acquired Roman territory, killing merchants or sacking minor colonies. But as their leaders slowly organized, the threat grew more severe.
And, we'll see the Roman interaction with the Germans throughout this series, but these Germanic tribes are really going to become the sort of boogeymen of the Roman Empire, largely due to Teutoburg Forest, which we'll get to talk about later in the series. But we'll see. Look, Teutoburg Forest is important, but it's not the entirety of the Roman relationship with Germania.
Next time, we'll introduce General Drusus at the beginning of the Germanic Wars. beginning a section of this series ultimately leading to Rome's most infamous defeat, the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest.
Yeah.
If you don't want to miss that and many other historical videos, make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button to see them. Please consider liking, subscribing, commenting and sharing, it helps immensely. Recently we've started releasing...
Alright, and hey, I'd appreciate if you do that on this video as well. Feel free to leave a like, feel free to subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed this one. The second episode in Kings and Generals series on the reign of Augustus. Last time we mostly dealt with politics, this time we dealt with military affairs. The next couple episodes, I mean, they're really pretty wide-ranging. Next time we'll talk about some of these Germanic campaigns and Drusus, who was a very prominent general during this time period. We'll talk about more of the reign of Augustus, the Illyrian revolt. Of course, a lot of this is leading up to the Teutoburg Forest, which was a massive moment in Roman history. And finally, the death of Augustus. Of course, another monumental moment. So yeah, I've been enjoying this series. I'd appreciate it if you guys would check out my Patreon, which is linked down below, and will give you access to a whole bunch of exclusive content. You can also check out our Discord, which is linked down below as well. So thank you everybody for watching this video. I hope you're all having a fantastic day today, and I will see you all again next time. Goodbye.